President Grimsson, here we are in Munich. I find it interesting that when we get to the topic of the Arctic, most people immediately want to focus on climate change. And certainly climate change is very important, as we know. But, as president of Iceland for 20 years, as the founder of the Arctic Circle, which is the most influential body on Arctic policy, there are other things that are going on. So since we're pretty much up to speed on global warming, maybe you would like to talk about some other issues that are present in the Arctic.
The fascinating thing about the Arctic is that it's only in the last 10 or 20 years that it has opened up for international cooperation and dialogue. And for most of us, it was a completely ignored part of the planet. And for most people, it still is, as is perhaps reflected by the state of the attendance here at the last session. But everything that has been discussed here today, this global digital transformation, the energy transformation, and all the issues that have dominated the sessions up to now, will be fundamentally and are already fundamentally impacted by the Arctic. And let me first say that the terminology is a bit difficult because the Arctic in most people's minds means a kind of a region or a limited area. But we are talking about a part of the planet which is almost the size of Africa, if it is all put together. The Arctic part of Russia is 7 time zones. It's more than twice the United States. Greenland is equal to half of Western Europe. And the melting of the ice in Greenland will have is already having a tremendous impact on the weather patterns, on the sea levels all over the world. But what has happened also in the last 5 to 6 or 7 years is because of the resources in the Arctic, the opening up of new shipping lines and communication, the Arctic has become a new geopolitical frontier where the United States, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, even France and Germany are now trying to position themselves in a way we have never seen before. So what was until very recently a very remote part of the world has now become a global geopolitical theater. A few weeks ago, Dorit and I were in China, where President Xi and President Putin celebrated the opening of over 8,000 kilometers long gas pipeline from the Arctic part of Russia all the way down to Shanghai. This monumental event in the energy history of our planet was hardly covered in the Western media. Last week, Russia announced a 15-year investment plan in the new Northern Sea Route evolution. And what is the new Northern Sea Route? It is the linking of Asia to Europe and America along the Arctic Russian coastline that will shorten the time span by 10 days, replacing the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz and the other areas which have dominated the global transport system for the last 100 years. President Trump and his administration have now decided to make Greenland a front line of the new US strategic view of the world. And although his tweet on buying Greenland was laughed at by most established media, it simply reflected a new focus of the American administration on the Arctic. And Secretary Pompeo, at the meeting of the Arctic Council ministers a few months ago, declared that within the framework of the new global competition between China and the US, the Trump administration sees the Arctic as an important part of that new confrontation or competition, or whatever we want to put it. In the addition, a great deal of the rare metals and the minerals needed for the global digital world that we have been talking about all day are found in the Arctic. So any major country in the world that wants to be a digital competitor or a major player in the 21st century has to have access to the resources in the Arctic. You cannot be a digital power in the 21st century unless you have access to Arctic resources. This is hardly talked about in the entire digital discussion, because somehow we talk about it as if it is made out of thin air, without realizing it's made out of concrete resources. That is why Greenland is so important. That is why Trump's tweet about buying Greenland actually makes economic business sense in the 21st century digital economic strategy. That's why China, Korea, Japan are all doing this. And it's one of the reasons why the Arctic Circle, which I established with other Arctic partners 6 years ago, has in an extraordinarily short time become the most important global platform on this new geopolitical reality or geoeconomic reality, with over 2,000 people coming to Iceland every October from over 70 countries, and us organizing sessions in Asia, in Europe, and in different parts of the world. So Scott, yes, you're right, the Arctic is crucial for the global climate, but it has also become crucial for the economic geopolitical competition in the 21st century.
Well, you know, after hearing all of that at one time, I feel like we all need to catch our breath because the events of the Arctic are having such a huge impact on the rest of the world. But, you know, as an investor, my primary job is to find investments that are good opportunities. As you know, President Grimsson, a large part of my time has been trying to identify where these investment opportunities are. Now, some people at this point, and I've been with the World Economic Forum, I was on their Global Agenda Council in the Arctic, which also included Greenpeace, would say that the Arctic should become a preserve for polar bears and penguins. My response to that is to say there are no penguins in the Arctic, and their response to that is, oh my God, they're extinct already. There were never penguins in the Arctic, if anybody knows. The reason I tell that joke is it is the lack of knowledge about the Arctic and its importance. And the commercial powers and the military powers that have an interest in the Arctic and see opportunity are very strong forces. And of course, you know, again, from our work together at the Arctic Circle and the World Economic Forum, the Arctic Investment Protocol, which has become the official policy of the Arctic Economic Council, is set a minimum standard to do this because of the delicate nature of the Arctic. But, you know, I like to bring an element of realism to this. Which is people believe there's this sort of either-or situation going on here. Either we allow economic development in the Arctic, or we don't allow economic development in the Arctic. First off, if you talk to the Swedes or the Norwegians, they're going to tell you, what do you mean you can't have economic development in the Arctic? We've been doing it for 1,000 years. So the reality is that economic development there is already strong and underway. In a lot of places people don't expect. Biotech, aquaculture, energy. Things that you don't pop to your mind because most people look at the Arctic and look at the natural resources and think that the great opportunity is to exploit the natural resources of the Arctic. But the opportunities that I see are much more interesting in these other areas. I know in your own country there are a lot of these things going on, so maybe you could share some of what you know.
No, you're absolutely right. The prevailing view of most people in Europe, the United States, is to look at the Arctic through pictures of polar bears and melting ice. But different from Antarctica, the Arctic is full of people, communities and states, and they want to be a part of the global economy. They want to be able to connect to other parts of the world. But it also has dawned on many major economic players, as I mentioned before, that the Arctic is very rich in resources that are absolutely critical for the largest economies in the 21st century. So the race between China and Europe and the United States will partly be determined, not completely, but partly be determined by their relative position in the Arctic. But what we are also seeing, which is interesting, is a new wave of Arctic tourism. Because especially the younger generation in Asia, the generation that only knows mega cities, has only experienced life in the multitude of other people, now want to come to the Arctic and the wilderness to experience the planet in a new way. That is why one of the major Malaysian entrepreneurs has now decided to become a major player in building hotels across the Arctic, and the local council in the capital of Greenland is now deciding whether they approve the design for his new hotel. That is why Helsinki, which was a pretty remote part of Europe, has now become the major Asian hub for airlines between Europe and Asia. And if you go to the Helsinki airport today, you will see more Asians there than actually Europeans. And that is why you are also seeing the port of Bremerhaven in Germany making agreement with us in Iceland to develop a new global harbor in northeastern Iceland to be a part of this new shipping traffic that will come through the Eastern Sea route. So we are also already seeing corporate decisions by airlines, by tourist agencies, by Malaysian investors, by the port on Bremerhaven, which is, I believe, the second largest port authority in Germany. In addition to the energy companies and everybody else, now seeing the Arctic in a completely new way. And one of the critical questions, which nobody really knows the answer to, is how will this balance between the climate concentration, the new geopolitical economic competition between China, US, and Europe, and the investment portfolio in the Arctic play out. But what is clear, that there is a new game that has started in the Arctic, similar to what happened 100 years ago in the Middle East, when France and Britain and the others entered the Middle East and started the Grand Game, as it was called. And that is what we have now seen emerging in the Arctic. So anybody who wants to have a realistic view of how the 21st century is moving and how the competition between Europe and China and America, which has been discussed multiple times here on this stage today, will have to start paying a great attention to the Arctic.
You know, when I had the opportunity to sit down with the former Secretary of State of the United States, George Shultz, and we were talking about this, his comment to me was that what we today are witnessing is the most important event in human history in the last 16,000 years. That if you can imagine picking your newspaper up one day and seeing a headline that reads, "The world discovers a new ocean," that's what's going on in the Arctic. And, you know, I think that, you know, the issue we're talking about, the indigenous peoples, which was the first group of people I went to visit in the Arctic, in North America, have a very strong interest, not only in seeing the Arctic developed from an economic standpoint for their own prosperity and health. More than half of the indigenous people in North America are alcoholic from lack of things to do. But in addition to that, are very concerned about preserving their way of life. They still whale, which one of the few people in the world that can legally do it, and they still hunt polar bear to live. And you know, they do not want to see their environment destroyed, just as the people of Iceland are concerned. So I know we're going to have to wrap up, but you know, what do you think about the efforts that are in place now to make sure that we're doing this economic development in a responsible way?
The good news is that a combined effort of indigenous people, environmental leaders, and other Arctic players, including your own role, Scott, have established a framework of standards. Some of them are written out, some of them are sort of culturally accepted, which means that any major economic investment that enters the Arctic has to meet the environmental and the community-based standards. And nobody can really enter the Arctic now, giving the political empowerment which has taken place of the indigenous communities. And Greenland is perhaps, with its self-government, the best example, but you have also seen such transformation in Canada, in Alaska, and other parts. So I am quite optimistic that the community social political pressure that is prevailing in the Arctic will serve as a guideline. That means that irresponsible fossil fuel-based, environmentally destructive investment will not be very prominent in the Arctic future. But then we have to offer other investment opportunities. And that is, I think, the challenge today. And for us in Europe and for us in the Arctic states, it is really a wake-up call why Japan, Korea, China, Singapore, India are now all observer states in the formal Intergovernmental Arctic Council. Why are these Asian powers so interested in the Arctic? Why has every one of the last 3 presidents of France appointed special envoys to the Arctic? It is because there is a recognition by the Asian countries that part of the new age of Asia, as we sometimes call the 21st century, will have to give them a prominent role in the Arctic. But then the Arctic is coming back to the Asians and say, okay, guys, but we want you to respect our standards, our regulations, and our laws. And what I find fascinating about the annual Arctic Circle assemblies in Iceland is how the representatives of Korea, Japan, China, Singapore accept this. accept to come every year to the Arctic Circle Assembly and be tested in their presentation, in their policies, and in their plans. But this is also an area where Europe has to play a big role. And what is a little bit scary is that, according to my information, among the policy documents that the new Commission has in front of it now in Brussels, there is hardly anything about the Arctic policy. And how the new Commission can present a Green Deal for Europe without having an enlightened and advanced Arctic policy, I can't understand. So I think the European Commission and the European Union now has a huge task on its hands with respect to the Arctic. If the Green New Deal of Europe is going to be meaningful, it will have to be accompanied by an investment, business, scientific, political, and environmental Arctic program. And the discussion on that has not yet begun in Brussels.
Well, as you know, we put together the Arctic Investment Inventory, which is now at the Wilson Center, as we announced in Reykjavik at the Arctic Circle. But to conclude, that inventory identified over $1 trillion worth of economic infrastructure which needs to be put in place. So, I think that this conversation is just scratching the surface at not only the challenges of the Arctic, but of the economic opportunity that will benefit all of us at the end.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.